Welcome to the Cafe Culture Podcast, a season of discussions on culture, politics, philosophy, and science.
Jan has written this book called Animal Deliberation, and it is about veganism and the challenging subtitle of Should Eating Meat, Animal Products Be Banned? I'm going to let him introduce the subject, but if you want to tweet about the talk, then please make sure that you use our @CafeCultureNE, which is our Twitter handle. And we want to thank the funders, because there are costs to arranging things like this. Newcastle University is a big funder of ours, Blackwell's and Costa Coffee. So thanks everyone for coming. And Jan, if you can come to the front.
Okay, good evening, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank Lorraine Sweeney and Lucille Valentine for inviting me to be present of this Café Politique, as well as Mariana and Blackwell's for hosting this presentation. I have been a vegan for the last 16 years, and this is my first proper book, Lucille. So. First proper book, so I've been thinking about this issue for quite a while, and the issue of whether or not my dietary choice should be something that I should advocate for others has been quite prominent on my mind for quite a long time. The book carries the title Animal Deliberation: Should the Consumption of Animal Products Be Banned? And the central chapter of this book tries to answer this question. It is this chapter that gains my attention tonight: the politics of qualified moral veganism. In work that precedes this chapter, it is argued that a good moral case exists for a partial ban on the consumption of animal products. The political case, however, is less clear. Before delving into the politics of veganism, I would like to recount briefly why the book makes a case for a partial ban, the evidence for which is provided in other parts of the book. In the introduction, I argue that a good moral theory should be concerned with the production of positive global health impacts. That is what we really should be concerned about when we live our lives. Do our actions produce positive global health impacts? Or, to put it differently, do our actions avoid negative global health impacts? While I realize that much of what we do bears some kind of moral cost, a good moral theory should be concerned with the good life. How can we live the best possible lives? And in relation to this question, and applied to the moral issue posed by the consumption of animal products, are there any reasons to believe that the consumption of animal products might prevent us from leading the best possible lives? In the first chapter, I then argue that if we compare the human consumption of animal products with the human consumption of other things, in many, but not all situations, the negative health impacts of the former exceed those of the latter, even if we ignore any impacts associated with how we treat other animals in the process. This is so because diets that rely on the consumption of animal products produce relatively more environmental and social costs. In the first chapter of the book, these are documented. And I point out particularly that there are significant environmental costs which are ignored by many people who adopt omnivorous diets and that they should nevertheless take into consideration. Apart from these environmental costs, for example, issues related to the impacts on climate change, land degradation, the use and pollution of water, the use and pollution of atmospheric resources, there is also the burden of human disease, where diets that involve the consumption of animal products carry a relatively greater burden on human disease compared to other diets. In the second chapter, I then draw on my personal experiences as well as the documented literature on how some of the animals who are consumed by us fare in their lives. And these personal experiences are based on my having worked on several farms in my youth, because I come from quite a rural background in the northern part of Belgium, and many of my relatives are involved in farming, particularly the farming of animals. If we reflect upon how animals fare in their lives in conventional as well as perhaps less conventional farms that we see around us, it presents a rather bleak picture, because a lot of pain and suffering is inflicted on other animals. Many scholars who have worked on the issue of pain perception have argued that vertebrates are capable of feeling pain, but there is increasing evidence that invertebrates may also be capable of feeling pain. I engage with the literature on animal welfare science in this regard. And I also engage with the moral issue whether inflicting death, even if it could be done painlessly, causes harm to animals. And I give a positive answer to this question. Yes, inflicting death per se causes harm to the animal, even if we do it without inflicting any pain or suffering on them. This leaves open the question, however, whether there would be something that might be morally problematic about eating animals who die naturally or accidentally. Say, what's wrong with eating an animal who dies naturally? We have not deliberately tried to inflict any pain or suffering upon this animal. Well, for example, think about the many animals who are killed on the road. Shouldn't we just pick them up and eat them? Would that be a good argument against the adoption of a vegan diet? Because we're not being wasteful by eating these animals. Here I argue cautiously that we have a natural aversion towards consuming the bodies of animals, but that this aversion is in tension with a natural attraction towards eating them. Whilst this attraction comes in handy in times of great need, in other words, people who are always adopting vegan diets will in some situations be limited with options as to what to eat. For example, in times when they cannot find sufficient plant foods, and they would lose out against humans who have a natural inclination to eat animals in those situations. I nevertheless argue that we do well to allow our aversion to trump our attraction at other times. However, I also recognize that many people will not agree with this conclusion. This raises the question how we are going to cater for those who are hell-bent on consuming animals. There does not seem to be an insufficiency of people who are hell-bent on continuing to consume animals. So, enter the stage the genetic engineering of animals and the production of lab-grown flesh. The former technology might allow us to engineer animals in such a way that they no longer care about how they are being treated or about how they are being killed. We could think, for example, about creating animals who have such minimal levels of consciousness that they are not aware of the fact that pain isn't being inflicted upon them. Think about animals that are perhaps decerebrated. They have not got a head at all. Wouldn't that be great? We could carry on eating animal products and not worry about inflicting pain on them. Perhaps they would not care about being killed either, because they simply do not have the concept of what it means to be killed. And their lives aren't valued by them anyway. The production of lab-grown flesh might allow us to engineer animal flesh from cells that are extracted painlessly from animals. And these cells would then be stimulated inside petri dishes to grow into burgers and other delicacies. And as many of you will know, the first such burger was consumed in London a few years ago. A burger that was entirely created simply from extracting a single cell from an animal, which was then manipulated to grow into multiple cells and turned into a burger in a lab. I oppose both the genetic engineering of animals and the production of lab-grown flesh, on the basis of the fact that they still rely on the problematic idea that it is okay for us to objectify animals for our consumption when there is no real need for us to do so because we have sufficient alternatives available. But I do welcome the latter in practice, as the objectification only pertains to cells rather than to whole animals. I find the objectification of cells less problematic compared to the objectification of entire animals through genetically engineering them. And I consider the production and the consumption of lab-grown flesh to be the second best option, at least in many situations. So what is the best option then? I argue for qualified moral veganism. My theory is qualified as I do not think people should adopt vegan diets in all situations. It is a moral theory that can be adopted by all people, even by those who should not adopt vegan diets for legitimate reasons. And these legitimate reasons could be simply the fact that they may need to import plant foods from a long distance away, or they may not have sufficient good quality plant materials available locally to be able to enjoy an adequate nutrition. It is called vegan, nevertheless, my theory, because I argue that vegan diets should be the default diets for the majority of the human population. Now, it is one thing to say that we need a new moral theory, but quite another to say that this should be implemented politically. I argue in the book that a benign dictator might have the power to impose veganism on the majority of the human population. But I also argue that I do not have the ambition to become a benign dictator. Whilst the majority is not always right, a reasonable political principle is to adopt the view that in order for a moral theory to be allowed to be adopted as a political theory, it must be supported by a sufficient number of people. So simply one person, one dictator, imposing their view, however benign it might look to me, on others, does not seem to be sufficient to be politically legitimate. In other words, we need to increase the number of people who are convinced that this is a sound moral theory. At this moment in time, I must face the fact that there is insufficient support for qualified moral veganism. In a recent article published on the 4th of October in The Guardian, George Monbiot writes that there are, quote, 500,000 vegans in the land of roast beef, unquote. I probably don't need to clarify to you which country he refers to when he speaks of the land of roast beef. I'm inclined to think that this estimate is rather optimistic. But even if we adopt the figure that there are 500,000 vegans in the land of roast beef, this is less than 1% of our population. So it is unrealistic to think that this 1% will wield such political influence as to be able to ban the consumption of animal products in the vast majority of situations. However, the population of vegans may nevertheless grow quickly through good education. So perhaps in order to bring about political change, we need to pin our hopes on good education. People who represent the status quo suffer from deeply entrenched habits that may be very hard to change unless good data is presented on the benefits of veganism. The vultures are out there, waiting to pick. One argument that they may throw at you is the fact that there is a lot of land on this planet that is simply not suitable for arable cultivation. They may say that vegans ignore that human beings cannot digest cellulose, unlike many domesticated animals, and that a predominantly vegan human population would therefore abandon an important source of human nutrition. This argument is countered in the same article by George Monbiot as follows. Quote, grazing is not just slightly inefficient, it is stupendously wasteful. Roughly twice as much of the world's surface is used for grazing as for growing crops. Yet animals fed entirely on pasture produce just 1 gram out of the 81 grams of protein consumed per person per day. Unquote. Note the slight problem with this argument, and it is important to get the data absolutely right because the vultures are out there. While it may be true that animals who are fed entirely on pasture yield no more than 1.3% of all the protein that is consumed by human beings, it does not tell us how many animals are fed entirely on pasture, or what other nutrients they might provide apart from protein. Whilst I do not disagree with his view that the use of grazing land is, in many situations, very inefficient, to keep the vultures at bay, it is necessary to present the data accurately, as well as to acknowledge that in some situations, for example, the situation of the Maasai in Kenya and Tanzania, the use of animals to graze the land produces a larger amount of positive human health impacts compared to any other system of food production. This is so at least in part because animals can travel from one area to another, unlike arable crops, which are more susceptible to the negative impacts of drought, which is a significant issue in countries such as Kenya and Tanzania, where much land is also degraded significantly and therefore unsuitable for significant arable production. Whilst degraded, it can nevertheless still produce grass as well as many other things that are eaten by browsing animals and that move from one area to another, and where overgrazing is not such a problem precisely because the animals can quickly move from one part of the country to another. The case of the Maasai also illustrates that a total ban on the consumption of animal products would take the arguments put forward by people such as Gary Francione be unacceptable. A second political strategy that I put forward is the adoption of financial mechanisms to disincentivize the production and the consumption of animal products and to incentivize the promotion of better alternatives. Currently, vast tracts of land in the UK are being incentivized to use a term coined by Monbiot, sheep-wrecked. Sheep-wrecked. Large and politically powerful landowners are the primary beneficiaries of this green and pleasant land. While better knowledge may be necessary to drive both educational change and the adoption of more appropriate financial mechanisms, my third political strategy, the aim to bring about a partial legal ban on the consumption of animal products, is unlikely to succeed without a significant change in values, or perhaps more appropriately, without significant numbers of people discovering what their values really are. I regularly question my commitment to qualified moral veganism. Perhaps it is my own values that need to be changed. Perhaps the omnivores have got it right after all. The best argument that I can identify against my position is the view that I underestimate the negative impact upon the millions of animals who are being cut up by the plow in arable farming. Some might claim that an omnivorous diet is far more benign in that fewer organisms are being destroyed. Only a few relatively large animals are being killed under carefully controlled circumstances in slaughterhouses, which cannot be replicated when farmers plow up the fields, tearing apart millions of small creatures in the process, who do not benefit from the quick deaths that befall the animals who are slaughtered in slaughterhouses. While I remain unconvinced of this argument that might be put forward by opponents to my position, it is something that I will nevertheless try to be mindful of, perhaps particularly around this time of the year, when I have to come to terms with the loneliness of celebrating Christmas, that great carnivorous feast, once again. At this point, my own deliberation ends, and I am keen to deliberate this matter with you, which is also what I try to do with others who shared their views when I interviewed them about this matter, and which I analyzed in chapter 4 of the book. I would like to thank you for listening, and I would like to open up for discussion right now. Thank you.